No way. Is that really you? The four-star general froze in place, eyes locked on the old man who had just thrown himself into the fire. No one knew his name. No one knew who he used to be, but one faded tattoo on his arm made an entire row of decorated officers rise to their feet and salute. Because sometimes the greatest hero is the one you've walked past for years without ever knowing. Welcome to Grateful Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. In Crestfield, Montana, Memorial Day wasn't just a date on the calendar. It was a rhythm the town moved to, quiet, steady, and full of memory. By late May, American flags fluttered on nearly every porch. Red, white, and blue bunting hung from lampposts like prayers stitched into fabric. At the center of it all was Harvest Street Diner, a small brick building with faded green trim and the same tin bell that had rung above its door since 1954. Every morning at 7:15 sharp, Frank Halstead walked through that door. He didn't need a menu, didn't say much either. Just sat in the corner booth by the window alone and ordered the same thing: black coffee, 2 slices of burnt toast. Frank was 76, but age clung to him like something heavier. Not just in his slow steps or the slight stoop of his shoulders, but in the way he looked out the window, like he'd seen things too big to fit back into words. He wore the same olive green jacket year-round, frayed cuffs, 3 missing buttons, and a name patch faded into oblivion. Some said it looked like surplus from Vietnam. Others weren't so sure. Clint Braxton had his own opinion. "God's sake," Clint said one morning, loud enough for half the diner to hear. "You'd think a vet would have the pride to iron his sleeves." He chuckled, sharp and rehearsed. Frank didn't respond. He rarely did. Clint Braxton had arrived in Crestfield 2 years ago, retired, loud, and full of war stories no one asked for. A former Army captain in logistics, Clint had spent most of his career behind desks, yet he told his tales like he'd dodged bullets daily, reorganized supply chains that became saving battalions from collapse, an award for paperwork efficiency that morphed into a commendation for operational excellence under duress. He always wore his old dress blues on weekends, kept his hair tight, boots polished, and a leather briefcase full of certificates and photos of handshakes with generals, all laminated. He picked the same seat every morning, just 2 tables from Frank, and every morning he managed to slide in a jab. Veterans like him, Clint scoffed. They're why people forget what honor looks like. At the counter, Marcy Turner, who'd been waitressing at the diner for 30 years, stopped pouring coffee for a beat. She looked at Frank, then looked away. She knew better than to explain him. So did Linda Monroe, a retired nurse whose husband never made it back from Fallujah, and Donnie Clark, the grease-stained mechanic who once offered Frank a ride home in a storm, no questions asked. None of them had ever heard Frank speak of his past. Not a single story, not a single medal. But there was something about the way he carried himself, not proud, not broken, just steady. Like a man who'd walked through hell and come out quieter on the other side. And then there was the tattoo, faint, almost gone, tucked beneath the sleeve of his left arm, barely visible when the cuff slipped. But once, just once, Linda had seen it clearly. It wasn't any ordinary service ink. A black dagger crossed with parachute wings. Underneath, a line of Latin she couldn't quite read. She'd seen thousands of combat injuries, treated hundreds of soldiers, but never that symbol. Later that day, she asked Donnie. He shook his head. "I only seen that once," he whispered, "back when I worked security at the Air Force Base. Guy came in for classified debrief. They made me clear the hallway, said it was Spectre 9 or something." Linda didn't ask again. Neither did Marcy. They just started saving the corner booth for Frank before he even walked in. No one said a word about it. Clint noticed, though. He noticed how Marcy topped off Frank's cup without being asked. How Donnie always gave Frank the weather report before he left. How Linda once pressed a folded napkin into his palm and simply said, "For your knee," and it bothered Clint more than he'd admit. This guy, Clint scoffed again, motioning toward Frank's coat, probably filled out a few forms and wants a statue for it. Frank didn't flinch, didn't even glance up. He just folded his newspaper, took a slow sip from his mug, and stared through the glass like none of it reached him. That only made Clint angrier. Outside, Memorial Day preparations were in full swing. The Crestfield War Memorial Garden had been swept clean. White folding chairs lined the grass. Flags hung half-mast. At the center stood the marble wall, engraved with 78 names. Boys who never came home. Fathers who left full of hope and returned only in folded flags. Each May, on the final Monday, the town held a candlelight vigil at 5 p.m. It wasn't fancy, just a few speeches, some music by the high school band, and hundreds of tiny candles arranged around a table of photos and letters, keepsakes left behind by the fallen. This year, General Elias Ward was flying in from Washington. Clint had told anyone who'd listen. He bragged that he'd emailed the mayor and expected to be called on stage. "Once Ward sees me," Clint said, puffing out his chest, "he'll remember. We had lunch after the Fort Carson review in '08. But Frank, he hadn't said a word about the vigil. No one saw him at the rehearsals. No one saw him on the planning committee. What they didn't know was this Frank Halstead had spent the past week quietly rebuilding the candle table. He came at night, when no one was around, with his own wood, his own tools, his own hands. Marcy saw him once from her car after closing shift, kneeling in the grass, hammering a loose plank into place. She didn't interrupt, didn't take a photo, didn't post it online. She just watched. Like watching a man tend to a grave no one else remembered. And when the sun rose the next day, the memorial looked untouched, but it wasn't. It had been restored by someone who remembered every name on that wall, not from books, but from breath, from battle, from blood. The transition from morning coffee to afternoon memory was seamless in Crestfield. By noon on Memorial Day, the town moved slower, almost reverent. Shops closed early, church bells rang soft and low. And at the heart of it all, Frank Halstead returned to the Memorial Garden. He came alone, as always, in no announcements, no clipboard, no name badge. But there, under the wide sky and flapping flags, he began his quiet ritual. He carried with him a canvas bag, faded tan, with leather straps worn thin. Inside were rags, a polish, a bottle of glass cleaner, and 2 bundles of wildflowers wrapped in newspaper. Frank knelt before each photo on the remembrance table. Not fast, not careless. He wiped away the dust like a man cleaning the face of a fallen friend. He adjusted every frame, realigned each candle base, and refolded the handwritten letters left by family members. Some pages had been curled by dew, others had sun-bleached edges. Frank smoothed them gently, flattening sorrow with calloused hands. Every few minutes, he paused, not to rest, but to remember. No one had assigned him this task. No one had ever asked, but for over 20 years, if Frank had shown up before every Memorial Day and made sure the fallen weren't forgotten. Not by speeches, not by plaques, but by touch. He never told anyone why. Marcy once tried to mention it in the church bulletin. Frank asked her kindly not to. He didn't want credit. He only wanted the work to be done right, and so it was. Each year, as the town gathered for the late afternoon vigil, they found the site pristine, like it had been tended by angels. But it hadn't. It had been tended by one man in an old coat with a limp and a secret. Back at the diner, Clint Braxton was holding court as usual. General Ward's plane landed this morning. He told Linda and Donnie, "I expect he'll recognize me from the Fort Carson Logistics Summit. We coordinated the motor pool overhaul together." Linda didn't respond. Donnie just sipped his coffee. Clint leaned in, voice lowering. "I'm betting he calls me up during the ceremony." He grinned. "Wouldn't be surprised if he hands me one of those commemorative coins." Donnie raised an eyebrow. "I thought this day was about the ones who didn't make it back." Clint waved him off. Sure. But you gotta honor the ones who kept the machine running too. Outside the window, Frank walked past head down, bag in hand, heading toward the memorial with the same pace he always had. Not hurried, not late. Clint watched him, scoffing. Still wearing that ragged coat, he muttered, "Guy probably never saw a day of combat." Marcy, polishing a glass behind the counter, stopped mid-motion. She didn't speak, but her eyes said enough. Across the square, a group of teens had gathered near the memorial table. 3 boys and a girl high schoolers, maybe freshmen. One of them held up a phone. They weren't being malicious, just careless. "Hey, check it out," one said. "That old guy's been out here all day. You think he's homeless?" Another laughed. "Probably thinks he's guarding the place or something." The girl hesitated. "He's wearing a military jacket." "Exactly," the first boy said. "TikTok loves this kind of thing. Salute the confused vet," or something like that. They crept closer, whispering, snickering. Phone at the ready, but just as they were about to hit record, Frank stood. Not fast, not abrupt. He simply rose with a bouquet of fresh flowers and placed them near the base of the wall. The wind caught his sleeve for a moment, flapping it back slightly, but not enough to reveal the ink beneath. Not yet. The teens paused. They watched as Frank bowed his head for a long, long time. No one moved. Then, one by one, without saying a word, the kids put their phones away and left. Because sometimes, even in youth, you feel when something is sacred. Clint arrived at the memorial site 30 minutes before the ceremony. He wore his full dress uniform, medals polished, nameplate gleaming. He nodded at the mayor, shook hands with a few city council members, then stood front and center waiting for recognition, for the moment his service would finally be spotlighted. Frank, meanwhile, sat quietly off to the side, near the back row, next to the rose bushes he had trimmed that morning. He didn't speak, didn't wave, just watched the flickering candles and the faces of the names he had cleaned, the ones who didn't come home. At exactly 4:55 p.m., a military SUV pulled up to the curb. Out stepped General Elias Ward, 6 feet tall, silver-haired and sharp-eyed despite his years. A murmur spread through the crowd. Cameras flashed. People stood straighter. Clint stiffened, adjusting his cap. This was it. This was the moment. But General Ward didn't look at Clint. Not yet. He scanned the memorial, walked slowly past the front row, paused at the photo table still smudged faintly from earlier wind, and then he saw Frank. Just a glimpse. At first, a man sitting in the background. Tired shoulders, faded jacket, one sleeve slightly rolled back from earlier. And for just a second, a mark caught the general's eye. A symbol, a black dagger, crossed with wings, and a line of Latin beneath it. General Ward stopped mid-stride. His breath caught, his eyes locked in, but the ceremony was about to begin. He said nothing. Not yet, because in less than 5 minutes, everything was about to change. At exactly 4:30 p.m., the mayor of Crestfield stepped up to the microphone. His voice was calm, practiced. The wind caught his notes and fluttered them slightly, but he continued. "Today," he said, "we remember the ones who never made it home." Flags lowered to half-staff behind him. 100 folding chairs faced the Crestfield War Memorial Garden, where candles flickered gently in the late afternoon breeze. Each flame represented a name. Each name, a life once lived. Frank Halstead sat in the second-to-last row, hands resting on his knees. His jacket was gone, used earlier to wipe the glass on the photograph table. He wore a plain white shirt now, sleeves rolled down to the wrists. General Elias Ward stood just off stage, waiting to be introduced. His eyes, however, weren't on the crowd. They were still fixed on Frank. He didn't say anything, didn't move, but something inside him had already shifted. The mayor continued. A local high school student read a poem. Then the choir sang a solemn rendition of Amazing Grace. And then it happened. A gust of wind stronger than any before rushed through the square. One of the decorative torches lining the memorial wobbled, tilted, and crashed into the main photo table. The crowd gasped as the flame hit dried flowers, then paper letters, then the corner of a folded American flag. Within seconds, fire began to spread. Someone shouted. A woman dropped her candle. Children clutched their parents. But before panic could take root, Frank was already moving. He didn't hesitate, didn't look around, just ran, straight toward the flames. Marcy Turner would later say she'd never seen a man that age move so fast. Linda Monroe dropped her cane in shock. Donnie Clark stood up without realizing it. Frank grabbed his military coat from the ground near the bushes. With both hands, he slammed it down onto the fire, smothering the worst of the flames in seconds. But as he beat back the burning paper, a shard of scorched fabric whipped up in the wind, a piece of the folded flag. It struck his left arm, still glowing with heat. Frank flinched, recoiling slightly. Then, with quiet urgency, he rolled up his sleeve to check the burn. And that's when everyone saw it. Not a scar, not a bandage, but a tattoo. Black dagger, parachute wings. Latin words etched just below Verdus in silentio. Courage and silence. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A few stood, others leaned forward. But General Elias Ward froze. His jaw tightened. His hands trembled at his sides. And then he walked, not toward the podium, not toward the microphone, but toward Frank. He passed the mayor, who called after him softly, confused. He passed the student still holding the burnt poem. His boots crunched softly on the gravel path, eyes never leaving that one man with the rolled-up sleeve. Frank had just finished stamping out the last spark. He stood slowly, rubbing the soot from his palms. Their eyes met, and for a long moment, no one else existed. Just two soldiers, one who had carried command and one who had carried ghosts. Ward stopped 3 feet from him, took off his hat, and said in a voice just loud enough to carry, "Spectre 9. Frank said nothing. Ward swallowed. His voice cracked. "We thought you were gone. You were listed KIA-the 1972 Operation Pale River. I was at the base when the call came in. They told us your entire unit was wiped out." Frank nodded once. "That's what they wanted you to believe." A hush fell over the crowd. Even the wind seemed to still. General Ward stood straighter. His hands moved to his side, and then he saluted. A full, formal, slow salute. The kind reserved for Medal of Honor ceremonies. The kind a general gives when standing before someone greater than himself. Frank didn't return the gesture. Not right away. He simply looked at him. And then, with quiet humility, gave a single nod. By now, people were standing. First the veterans, then the mayor, then the choir, even the teenagers in the back, even the girl who'd almost filmed him earlier. One by one, hands lifted to brows. And the town of Crestfield stood in silent tribute to the man they'd passed every morning without a second glance. Ward turned to the crowd. He didn't need a microphone. "This man," he said, voice deep and steady, "is why I'm standing here today. 53 years ago, his team saved mine from being overrun in the jungle. He let us out, then vanished. We thought he died a ghost." He paused, but he didn't die. He came home, and while we moved on, he stayed here watching over the fallen, guarding their names, caring for their memory when no one else would. Ward's voice wavered, and today, he just saved them again. Not with a rifle, but with a coat, a hand, and a heart that never left the field. Frank stood still, eyes lowered, but there was a flicker of something in his chest, a kind of release. Not pride, not recognition, just peace. Clint Braxton didn't speak, didn't blink. He stood in the third row, frozen, and for the first time in his life, He realized he'd spent years trying to prove he was a soldier while standing in the shadow of one who never had to say a word. The fire was out, the candles still burned, and the names on the wall shimmered in the orange light of early evening. A trumpet played taps, slow, clean, final, and frank. He just walked back to his bench, sat down, and watched the sun finish setting over the hill. By sunrise the next morning, the footage had already gone viral. Someone had captured it on a phone. Frank Halstead, without hesitation, throwing himself into the fire, smothering flames with a jacket older than most of the crowd, protecting memories, not just objects. But what set the internet ablaze wasn't the fire. It was the moment after, when Frank rolled up his sleeve and revealed a tattoo almost no one recognized but those who did. They knew exactly what it meant. Spectre Recon 9, the unit that wasn't supposed to exist, the mission that never made it into briefing rooms, the name whispered across military history as myth until now. Within hours, phone calls poured into Crestfield Town Hall, veterans groups, Army historians, a Pentagon liaison requesting confirmation. The mayor gave one answer: there's nothing to confirm, just come see for yourself. But Frank, he wasn't online. He didn't own a TV, and he certainly wasn't reading the news. At 7:15 a.m. sharp, he walked into Harvest Street Diner, took his seat by the window, and ordered black coffee and burnt toast, same as always. Marcy slid the mug across the counter without a word. Her eyes were misty, but her smile was steady. Linda nodded from her usual corner, hands wrapped around her tea. Donnie raised two fingers in silent salute before returning to his paper. Nothing was said out loud, but everything had changed. The diner, once filled with background noise and idle talk, now held something different, a quiet weight of respect, thick and unspoken. Frank sipped his coffee, looked out the window like he always did, and then the bell above the door chimed. Clint Braxton stepped inside, but not like before. No uniform, no medals, no briefcase full of laminated credentials. Just jeans, a plain shirt, and a face that no longer wore pride, but something heavier: regret. He didn't head to his usual booth, didn't puff his chest or greet the crowd. He walked straight toward Frank's table, paused. "May I?" Frank didn't look up at first, then slowly. He nodded once. Clint sat across from him, folded his hands. There was a long silence. Finally, Clint spoke. "I was wrong about you," he said quietly. "I think I was wrong about a lot of things." Frank said nothing. He didn't need to. "I used to think service was about recognition," Clint continued. "About proving something, about being seen." He looked down at the tabletop. "But you served in a way I never understood. And I just want to say I'm sorry. And if you'll let me, I'd like to help." Frank reached into his canvas bag, pulled out a clean, folded cloth. He handed it across the table, then looked Clint in the eye. "Start from the left," he said softly. "Wind kicked up last night. The glass is covered in dust." Clint took the cloth in both hands. He didn't speak. He just stood, nodded, and followed Frank out the door. Across the square, the Crestfield War Memorial Garden sat in the early light, candles long extinguished, flowers slightly wilted. But the names on the wall still shone, still waited. Frank knelt first, gently, deliberately. He began to wipe the photo of a young Marine barely 20. His fingers worked slowly, reverently. Clint stood beside him, then dropped to one knee and started on the next frame. Side by side, they moved along the wall, not speaking, not hurrying, just cleaning, just remembering. The square remained quiet. No crowds, no cameras, only the birds above, the soft scrape of cloth on glass, and the sound of old hands teaching younger ones how to honor the fallen. By mid-morning, the sun had risen over the trees, Its light stretched across the granite, highlighting every photo, every name. Marcy stood across the street, arms folded, eyes wet. Linda and Donnie joined her a few minutes later. They didn't call out. They just watched, because this wasn't a performance. It was a passing of duty, a changing of hands, and a reminder that remembrance isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, soft, deliberate. Later that week, a letter arrived for Frank from the Department of Defense, an official invitation to speak at Arlington, to receive formal recognition. To have his story entered into the permanent record, Frank declined. He sent back a note, handwritten. "I've already said everything that matters." It read, "It's on the wall, next to their names." That was all. No signature. Just a small sketch at the bottom. A dagger, wings, and the Latin phrase, virtus in silentio, courage in silence. That summer, things didn't change much in Crestfield. Frank still showed up at the diner every morning, still sat in the same booth, still drank his coffee slowly. But every Thursday afternoon, without fail, Clint met him at the memorial. Two rag, two men, one purpose. And in that simple act, the town learned something new. That honor doesn't need an audience. It needs consistency. That legacy isn't in awards. It's in who keeps showing up. And that sometimes the greatest heroes aren't the ones on the stage, but the ones kneeling quietly beside the names no one dares forget. There are victories history never writes down, and men who never asked to be remembered but are, by the way they lived, by the lives they carried, and by the dust they never let settle on the faces of the fallen.